Hello and welcome once more to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay, and today my guest is Prakash Mackay. Hi, Prakash.
Hi.
And Prakash has worked with people that are in the process of dying for 28 years, and it's a subject that we'll have to face at some point. I know in one way we all feel we're not going to die, but another way we know we are going to die. And it's something we really haven't covered very much on Conscious TV. So I was interested. I've known Prakash for a time. He's actually Scottish, but he lives in Hawaii now, and he's in town in London. So I was interested in sitting down with Prakash and just hearing his story a bit, because he has an interesting story of very much a situation where he was given 3 months to live. He's still here, so the 3 months wasn't very accurate, but just to see what he went through and also what other people go through in the process of dying. So, Prakash, you were born in Glasgow, and you were telling me on the phone the other night that actually you have a degree in psychology.
Psychology and drama.
Psychology and drama, and you were working as a teacher in Glasgow. Then you had a kind of a calling when you were looking out the window.
Yeah, I was just standing there, and I heard this voice saying, "You've been in school since you were 5 years old. It's time to get out and be in the world." And I was kind of shocked at hearing this, but I felt the rightness of it.
So when you say you heard a voice, you heard like as it wasn't sort of, it was an internal message, if you like.
Well, it was a voice saying,
okay,
"You've been in school since you were 5. It's time to get out."
And what form did that take?
So at that time, my father's sister was visiting from Australia, and I was telling her that I was wanting to just travel the world. So she invited me to come and stay with them in Australia. So I took about 9 months to go overland, and just being a wanderer, and that was 1976. So I was privileged enough to go through Afghanistan and places that you can't visit anymore.
Iran, I guess.
Iran.
Pakistan, probably.
Yes, very quickly.
Yeah, which, that's right, must have been incredible, because they're beautiful countries.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, but now, lucky to get out alive there, wouldn't you?
And I was doing this alone, you know, so I couldn't do that now.
Well, you were hitchhiking or driving?
Well, in Istanbul, I picked up a truck that was going from Dusseldorf to Kathmandu, and so I travelled as far as Herat in Afghanistan, and then I wanted to have a more adventurous spirit, so I got off the bus and went on a little WAS truck up the northern route to Mazar-e Sharif on the Russian border.
But where did this spirit come from? Was it always with you, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, since I was, like, when I was 16, I hitchhiked to Paris with £10 in my pocket, and it was like I just wanted to explore and see what the world was like, see what their cultures were like.
Yes. I think that's right. When we're younger, we see the exploration of more on the outside, and often when we're older, we see it also includes the inside, and you want to get out and see the world. I get that completely.
Yeah.
So what happened in Australia?
So in Australia, I was working with, it was called the Young Adults Employment Program, and there were teenagers from 15 to 25 who weren't able to find work, and I was creating programs to give them employment skills, and I was doing that in a couple of cities in Western Australia. And then I encountered, at that time, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who's now called Osho.
Right.
And I started doing meditations and listening to his tapes, and that took me to India.
You also told me on the phone that you did an encounter group, and that kind
I
of
did, yeah.
What was that like?
Well, when I first heard him speak, I was very struck by the articulation of thoughts that I'd had in my head, and to hear them spoken back to me was very exciting. And then when I went through this encounter group, the authenticity and intensity of it was like, this is how I want to live my life. And these people were aspiring to that also.
They were pretty wild in those days.
Pretty wild, yeah. So in '78, I went over to India, and I lived in the ashram there for about 3 years.
So you lived in his community there?
I did.
What was that like?
It was absolutely beautiful, you know, to be so dedicated to practice and meditation, you know, a whole community of people who had that shared goal of awakening. You know. He described it as an experiment to provoke God.
And what did awakening mean to you then?
Well, at that time I had a very different understanding of it. The way he described his own experience was that it was a one-off experience and he shifted. And then he was in a transcendent state all the time. So that was what my idea of, that's what I thought enlightenment meant.
And why did you want that?
That felt like that honesty, that authenticity, that intensity, that passion.
Yes.
I'd felt that spark in the way that we related to each other in the encounter group.
Yeah, there was, that feeling of aliveness.
Total aliveness, yeah. I mean, one of his main meditations was called dynamic meditation, which really, you know, freed up the energies in the body to give you that experience of dynamism. Yes,
yeah. So, you know, I should say, as you know, that I was also a Sannyasin of Rajneesh for 3 years, and I did these meditations, and I know it.
So you know that, yeah.
It was very transforming in many, many ways, yeah. So you then, the community moved to, you left India and moved to a ranch in Oregon, North America, and I think there was a break in between, but you went to Oregon. And how was that? Because that was different then, wasn't it?
It was completely different. You know, I mean, the focus there was building a city. And, you know, so you were working, you know, sometimes 22 hours a day. You know?
Yes.
Very little sleep, but the whole energy carried you on that. And again, it was a very exciting experiment, you know. And to be a part of that was really, really wonderful.
And I think it was there that you first got interested, because there's people living on the ranch that had AIDS.
Yeah.
And at that time, AIDS was a very taboo thing, wasn't it? It was scared people.
Very unknown. People were very afraid because they didn't know how people contracted the disease. So the people who were designated as having HIV were segregated. And I really felt very angry about that. And so I would go and be with them in their segregated place, because many of them were my friends.
Yeah, because that's right. At that time, I remember when AIDS was first announced, it was like it was a death sentence. And you had AIDS, and you basically had a few months or whatever, and it was a pretty ugly death, and your immune system didn't work properly, and there was no question that was it.
Yeah.
And as you say, people didn't know how it was communicated, so you thought even touching somebody with AIDS.
Really, yeah. It was just a whole atmosphere of fear around that.
And you were willing to overcome your fear and touch somebody with AIDS at that point?
Yeah.
But didn't you have fear of getting it
yourself? I did have fear. And yeah, I didn't want to bring that fear to someone who was already terrified. So I would just hold my fear and be there with them.
Well, it's an incredible, compassionate thing to do when you don't know the consequences for yourself. Do you realise that? That was a huge step.
I didn't realise at the time how it was, but it was like a calling in a way.
Okay.
And the calling was that I could see how fearful this experience was for the people dealing with it. And however I could lessen that for them, I wanted to be there for them in that way.
Yeah. So again, when you say a calling, just describe how you felt the calling.
In a way, it overrode the fear and aversion that I had. And I think it was also a response to how I responded to one of my first friends who did die of AIDS.
Yes.
And I was so afraid that I was afraid to go and be with him. And I felt so much shame about that. And that, I think the counter response to that was to say, I'm not going to do that. So however I can be, I'm going to show up. So that became part of that thread of really working with my own fear.
Yeah, and I kind of looking back on it, you know, you guys, and there was other people that did that as well, I know, you were really heroes because you kind of were willing to challenge your fear, go into the unknown, and it did turn out that just to touch somebody with AIDS didn't give you AIDS.
No.
It wasn't like certain disease, the Black Plague or whatever, where you can actually get the disease through touching the person. So you were willing to actually take that risk and find it out.
Yeah. When I first went to Maui and was working with AIDS patients in the hospital, the doctors were dressed in full hazmat gear.
Yeah.
And this, you know, the women who were bringing the food would leave the food outside the door. And I would go in like this, and they would say, "You're crazy, you're going to get it." But again, it was like, okay, if that's what I have to deal with, so be it. Did
you at that point have a deeper realization of who you were? That, you know, we talk about this sometimes on quite a lot on Conscious TV, that ultimately the whole journey is to find a deeper level of who you are, and you get to this point where you realize that you're not just a separate human being, and actually that opened so many doors.
Well, I'd been meditating since I was 17.
Yes.
You know, I was initially initiated into transcendental meditation.
Yes.
And so that was my introduction to that deeper place. And then the meditations with Osho, you know, they deepened that.
Because to explain, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, he changed his name
He
later
changed
to
his name to Osho.
Yeah.
You know, he had so many different types of meditations just to give you different entryways into that experience of who you were beyond the mind, beyond the body.
Yes.
You know, what the Buddha nature or the soul was, you know. And that became very much a part of my interaction with someone who was faced with a terminal illness. It's like I'd work with them to see what would connect them to something bigger than themselves.
Okay, so it wasn't just about having the compassion to be with them, it was also helping them to see that there were more than the human side.
Yeah, at that time there were very few resources available. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying was available, Stephen Levine's books. And one of the first books that I came across was a book by Ram Dass called How Can I Help? And in that, he talks about giving 4 hours of your time away to someone else.
And a day or a week?
A week.
A week, okay.
Yeah, just in service.
What a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
I think that's generally forgotten about these days.
Yeah.
So you give 4 hours or whatever you can of your time just to helping somebody else or other people.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's where I went to the Life Foundation on Oahu, and I became an AIDS volunteer.
Okay.
Initially.
So you left the ranch, Rajneeshpuram in America, and you went back to, you went to Hawaii.
I went to Hawaii.
Yes, yeah. And then you started to work full-time as a volunteer working with people with AIDS.
Yeah, I was working for the AIDS Foundation, and I did my first hospice training with Hospice Hawaii on Oahu.
Yes.
Yeah. And then when I moved to Maui, I came to Hospice Maui and I said, you know, I'd like to volunteer to work with your AIDS patients. So that became my, my specific assignment.
And there was this point, I don't remember when, maybe this was after you were doing this work, but where it became evident that AIDS wasn't necessarily a death sentence.
Oh yeah.
If you were intelligent in terms of how you lived, you'd have to always be careful, but you wouldn't necessarily die of it.
Yeah, well that came with the introduction of the protease inhibitors, you know, and then that completely changed the death sentence to a chronic illness that could be managed. You know? But that on, the period before then was like being in a war zone.
Yes.
You know, I remember that one of the heaviest days, 3 of my patients died on the same day. 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and 1 at night. And it was very demanding, and at that point I felt I can't keep doing this.
I was going to say, how do you do that? You get, you know, I think we've all been in, well, nearly all of us have been in situations where somebody closest to us have died, and we've been, and you know, we visited them and watched it, deterioration, and talked to them and everything else. But to have it on a daily basis, it's just, well, that's being in a war zone, isn't it? Really, it's like you're confronted with. And I think having talked to doctors and read about how doctors deal with it a lot, they have to switch off their human side to some extent. Not that they're inhuman, but it's too overwhelming. For you were also emotionally involved because you cared for the people.
Yeah, and I didn't want to shut down because I felt that what I was bringing to the person in this dying process was my presence. And if I shut down, I disconnected from that presence. Yeah.
So when you say you bring your presence, what do you mean by that?
Fully showing up, even with the fear that I'm feeling, you know. And if I'm emotional, then I express that emotion with them. It's like I'm not in a role. I'm there in my full personhood.
So you're being yourself.
I'm being myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and as I say, sometimes that was being very scared, and at that time, as I say, I felt overwhelmed and that I couldn't do it anymore. And I worked with a Roshi Joan Halifax, who was teaching a program called Being with Dying. And I went to her center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Upaya, and I did a 10-day Being with Dying retreat with her and other professionals. And that really gave me a sense of renewal. You know, it was like I'd become so identified and so burdened by all of the emotion that I'd dealt with for about 9 years without any respite. And that really gave me the space to come back, and I worked for another 12 years after that.
And how were you different when you came back with the patients?
I was lighter. Yeah, I didn't feel so responsible. You know, in a way, that it was like, in that book, Ram Dass talks about the helper's prison. And in that helping role, you feel as though you have to fix something. And you can't fix death. The outcome is inevitable.
Yes.
And yet the helplessness that you feel in the face of that inevitability, you really have to surrender to something bigger. And at that point, I was still identified with, I'm the one helping. You know, and after working with Joan, it was like it gave me some more spaciousness, and I brought that spaciousness to the work with my clients.
So it's intimate, but not so personal. You still have the intimacy, but it's not like, you're saying you didn't feel responsible, so it's difficult to describe, isn't it?
Yeah,
there's a personal connection.
But not the personality.
Yes, exactly.
It's the personality that has that identification that I'm here trying to help this person. And the personalness that came from my being could hold that in a way that didn't burden me. Because in a sense, I wasn't doing it.
So the I, which is the separate I, wasn't there so strongly.
Exactly, yeah.
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 It's a big key, isn't it? I'm just thinking it through as we talk about it. Yeah, it's like you're there, but you're not too personally there, which sounds as though you're less there, but that's in a way you're more there.
You're more there
because then you're more of the fullness of who you really are with the person.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where the real healing, and not necessarily always a physical healing.
And that's what I was learning in meditation.
Yes.
You know, how to relax more and more into that space of non-doing and being.
Yes. And not, you know, this is always, it can be confusing for people. So not doing doesn't mean to say you don't do anything.
Right.
It just means there's a degree of element of choicelessness. Is that right?
Yeah. In a way, it's like a non-interference. Okay. You're not manipulating your experience, and you're not trying to make something happen. You know, so often, what happens when you're dealing with a terminal illness, that there can be physical pain there, and we we're not really taught how to be with our pain. What the ego does is it rejects. And so what I would do is I would help someone to soften to that pain and to embrace and open to it. You know, and that's quite an edge to work. Yeah. And so I would use the breath a lot. You know, when someone's afraid and in pain, often the breath gets caught. So I would sit with them, and I would match their breath resonance, and then I would slow down.
Yes.
And then they would pick up from me, and that would help them drop out of that kind of fear response.
Yes. So also around this time, I think it was around this time, you started a new spiritual path with the Ridwan School.
I did, yeah.
Just tell us how that came about and how that was for you.
Well, you know, the last time I went to India was in '89 because I wanted to complete my relationship with Osho. I had been introduced to the Diamond Approach by a friend of mine, and I felt I needed to complete it before I could take on a new path. And my friend Christine had been to Esalen and worked with Hamid Ali, A.H. Almas, and she came back and
just to put it in context for people who don't know, he's
the founder of
the Ridwan School, also known as the Diamond Approach,
and the method of which is the Diamond Approach.
Yeah.
And so she came back very enthused, and also with one of his books, The Pearl Beyond Price, which I read and was really excited by. And she asked Hamid if he would come to Hawaii and start a group there. And at that time he had a home on the Big Island, so he said he didn't want to do that, but he gave her the name of one of his senior teachers, Morton Latowski.
Yes.
So Christine worked with Morton, and then Morton said, if you get a few people together, I'll come and start a group.
And why did that attract you and impact you and help you, that kind of training?
What really struck me was that until that time, I viewed my spiritual path as being very separate from the world. And what this teaching was talking about was that they're not separate. That it really was an integration of one's life and one's spirituality.
Yes.
Day-to-day life. You know, a phrase that Hamid uses is to be in the world but not of it.
Yes.
And that was very appealing to me, because I really was very engaged in the world at that time. You know, I was working as the spiritual care coordinator, the bereavement coordinator, and the counsellor for Hospice Maui. You know, and
and it's not always helpful for people when they know they're dying to just talk on the bigger picture. That's part of it, of course. It's the important part, but there's the reality of the human body and the frailties, and as you said, the pain and the emotions they have about the attachment to people and situations.
And the way hospice views that process is it really looks at the physical, emotional, psychological and spiritual needs of not only the patient who's dying, but the whole family, you know, as a system. You know, so you're having that overview to meet those needs, and really, you know, I would work with the patient as my main advocate, but then I would really see how I can meet the needs of the family.
Yeah, okay, so it's an inclusion of everybody concerned, And then you had your own scare, didn't you? Because you were given your own death sentence.
I was, yeah. In 2009, I was having a numbness and a burning throughout my face and the right side of my body. And so I went to the doctor, and you know, they were kind of amused. They did MRIs and spinal taps and blood tests, and then one night I was in the car park. I also train Aikido. I was coming out of the dojo, and my phone rang, and the doctor said, "Well, I got the results of your blood, and I'm really concerned." And I gave them to our oncologist, who's also really concerned. And I went, "Oh," and it really shook me up.
Yes.
And so he wanted me to come in, and what they had found was, it's called a monoclonal protein, which is a marker for multiple myeloma.
Yes.
So I went in, and the oncologist said, "You know, we don't have a cure for this cancer." so you have about 3 to 6 months to live. He said, I can offer you chemotherapy, but there's really nothing we can do for you. And in spite of having worked in the field of death and dying for, 20 odd years, when that message came to me, I went into total terror. It was so humbling, because I felt as though I was relaxed with death. I mean, I'd sat at the bedside of 400 or 500 people and helped them to die.
So you'd helped 400 or 500 people to die?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yet, when it came to me, I was totally taken by surprise. And what happened was the animal instinct of self-preservation kicked in. And I went into this fight or flight, freeze response. And the day I went to the oncologist, I took my friend who's a doctor and my partner, and they listened, because he could have been speaking Chinese. I couldn't even understand what he was saying to me. Yeah. But what came up for me was that I felt, no, I don't want to do chemotherapy. I want to explore more what this is really about. And I visited my naturopath, who...
Well, hang on, because obviously I know the outcome of the story, because you're still here.
Right.
So I'm interested more, though, in terms of what you went through, the emotions you went through, and the feelings, and did you start to do anything practical about planning for death, or was this all a bit too premature?
Well, as I say, I was more in a space of shock and numbness.
Yes.
I couldn't act.
Okay, so so, and was there still denial there as such?
Well, I mean, I wasn't ready to accept what he was saying, even although they were certain. This blood test is pretty certain for them. But something said, no, I don't think so. Well, I don't know whether it was denial.
Yeah, but this is important. So what you're saying is it wasn't necessarily a clear voice like you heard, but there was something in you saying that maybe this isn't right.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Yeah. Because I didn't say, okay, I'll sign up for chemotherapy. It was like, no, I want to see if there's anything else I can do.
Okay, so just continue. So you went to...
So I went to my naturopath, and he used a machine called the Vega to diagnose. And he said, you've got an electric current in your face. I said, what? What do you mean? He said, yeah, there's a current. And it's burned the neural pathway. And what had happened was I had 2 gold crowns with amalgam fillings underneath them, and that created a battery, the dissimilar metals. So there was a current, and that, when I got the teeth out, and I mean, I'm still experiencing the numbness, the symptoms are still there, but I cleared that monoclonal protein.
So the blood test next result was okay?
After about 3 months. I did chelation, which was to clear the heavy metals from my body, and then I redid the blood test, and it was clear.
What did the doctors say when you went back?
They didn't kind of believe what I was saying, but he eventually realized it was a misdiagnosis.
Yeah. He gave you a death sentence.
Yeah.
And it wasn't.
I dodged a bullet.
You dodged the bullet, or the gun wasn't loaded in the end.
Yeah. And it turned out to be a gift in a strange package, because it was, as I say, it was very humbling. In a way, being so intimate with death, I had become complacent, and I thought, I'm cool. I'm not afraid of death, and this showed me that I had more work to do. So it deepened my practice.
Yeah, you told me on the phone that you always had the idea you were unlovable. And that's something that was important that came out of this.
Well, when I was given it, the diagnosis, I didn't really want to tell many people. And one of my friends told Sandra Maitri, who was her teacher in California, and she said, no, he has to let people know. So I did. I wrote to the school and told people what I was dealing with. And the outpouring of love and support that came towards me, it really challenged that self-identity, that no one really cared, that I didn't matter to anybody.
Yes.
I really felt deeply loved, and I felt that love for myself. And I had never felt that before. Yeah.
So you had an old pattern,
Yeah.
which somehow hadn't been touched so far or really challenged some.
It was very deeply imprinted.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what else, what other work did you do in terms of clearing?
Well, you know, at the time when I was going through this, I had a 10-day retreat with Morton and Deborah on absence. You know, so here I'm looking at the future of me being absent, and I'm looking at the quality of being that is both a presence and an absence at the same time. And working with that edge helped me to come out of the fear and shock and really look at, well, who am I? You know, do I end with this when this body goes? Is there anything after death? It's still a deep mystery. I don't know, but there was a relaxation that happened after that experience.
Okay, so what would be, I think, really of value is we could make the last 20 minutes or so a kind of a practical, very practical in terms of, obviously there's always people in your situation, and unfortunately it's not a misdiagnosis, although that's a great call for people to challenge the diagnosis and make absolutely sure it is the right, get a second and a third and even fourth opinion maybe. So you mentioned that when you were first had the diagnosis, or you were shocked and there was a numbness. So just go through the stages that you've learned that people go through in terms of when they're...
Well, as I was mentioning, when I began in this field, the major resource was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying.
And she's died. She's dead herself now.
She died in about 2004.
Yes.
And you know, when Elizabeth started doing her work, she was really challenging the place where people who were dying were just left alone in the back rooms of hospitals. And Elizabeth felt, no, that's not right. And so she brought the terminally ill patients in to work with her students, and she would have them interview them. Very emotional, very intimate, and people really criticized and judged her for doing this. But through doing that work, she saw that there were certain stages that someone who was dealing with a terminal diagnosis goes through. You know, and the first one being denial. You know, it's like, oh no, this is not happening to me. Because the reality of a terminal diagnosis is more than the ego can handle. And the denial is a coping mechanism. You know, but when that breaks through, then the reality, it's like the anger that comes up. No, why me? Yeah. And then, you know, through... When I would work with someone in this situation, I'd really normalize that, give them the space to express in a safe way the feelings that were coming up, you know. And then they would move into a place of bargaining. Oh, if you give me 6 more months, I'll do whatever you want, you know. You know.
I'll forgive my mother or father or something.
Right. Yeah. And then the dropping into a depression and a sadness, you know, the helplessness around this, you know, and then working through that, coming to a place of acceptance, where, yeah, okay, this is my next stage. And Elizabeth described death as the final stage of growth, that it was actually an opportunity to move into that space where you are beyond the body, beyond the mind. Yeah. And, you know, as I say, I worked with probably over 500 people, and that was rare for someone to go through all of these stages. And they're not linear, you know, they kind of go through and spiral. But the general pattern was very much like that. Yeah.
It's like, you know, observing people that I know that I was close to that died. It's like, it's interesting because you start off the first few years of your life and you're pretty helpless. And you have to be looked after, and well, looked after in the first few years, many ways, and then even after that you have to be looked after in certain ways, certainly financially and guided and things. And then usually if someone has a slow death, there's a slow deterioration, and then again you have to get looked after. Having been independent or felt you were independent most of your life, you go back to that again, and you're kind of wasting away, and then you know you're going to die, and you're reliant on people, and it's a very difficult process, isn't it, for many people?
Yeah, one of the issues that I came across time and again was the feeling that the dying person had that they were a burden to their family.
Yes.
And so they didn't want to be so beholden. And so that took a lot of work, you know, from the family to them, to let them know, no, we want to do this for you. It's not a burden.
It's interesting, we were talking earlier, and our friend, your friend as well, Lynn, who brought you here today, a friend of her mother who died, Tosho, who I also knew, he was when he was dying, he drove, from what I heard anyway, he drove people crazy in the hospice where he was, because he kept saying, we're all going to die, isn't that fantastic? What an adventure, what happens when we die? And of course it didn't go down too well, apparently. But in a way, I suppose that is a great way to handle it, if you can genuinely do that.
Well,
because it is the ultimate adventure, and no one knows the answer.
No. And that's an expression of how Tosho lived his life. So that's how he's going to meet his death. You know, and that was something that Elizabeth observed in the many people that she worked with. How you meet your death is very much how you met your life. So if you lived your life as an adventure and, you know, an exploration, then death is an amazing adventure.
And if you lived your life in a narrow way full of fear, then that's the way
how
you
you're
approach
going
death.
to meet it. And part of my work would be to try and help the person move out of fear into a place where they could, you know, you've heard of the bucket list.
I haven't, no.
You haven't?
No.
Oh. You know, the bucket list, what are the things that you want to put in your bucket to do before you die? Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, with one woman, you know, I was exploring with her, and I said, well, you know, if there was one thing in your life that you could have done, what would it have been? She said, well, I always wanted to go and see Venice. You know, well, there's nothing I can really do about that. And then we started talking, and she asked me what kind of music I liked. And I said, well, it's funny you should say, I just picked up a new video of Annie Lennox, Diva. It's in my car, would you like to hear it? And I went out and I got this video, we put it on, and we're sitting there, and every song is Annie Lennox in a different place in Venice. And it was like, in Hawaiian they call it chicken skin, you know, goosebumps. It was one of these really mysterious events that, you know, I couldn't have set that up. And time and again, I would be on that edge of that mystery where amazing synchronicities would happen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what I'm picking up from you, and as I say, it's a very new subject for Conscious TV, and I haven't thought it through very much, but what I'm picking up from you that really, and I suppose it's obvious in one way, how you live your life is a preparation for how you die.
Yeah, Plato said philosophy is the preparation for death.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and I know in certain cultures, very much they start preparing for when they're going to die, almost from when they're a teenager. It's like they have their various ceremonies there when you become, for males, when they become a man, and then it's death is something that is not kept in the closet, so to speak. It's something that's out there in your face.
Right. You know, and as I say, Elizabeth really brought death out of the closet. And there have been many developments. You know, the work of Roshi Joan Halifax with Being with Dying.
Yes.
And there's another woman, Kathleen Dowling Singh, who worked in a hospice in Florida, who wrote a book, The Grace in Dying, where she takes Ken Wilber's model, the quadrants, and looks at the process of dying in each of these quadrants. And that was a very powerful resource for me, working with some patients who had more of a philosophical bent. You know, I would share elements of the book with them, and we'd see how that related to their own life and their own situation.
So you touched on earlier about the people who are close to someone that's dying, and that could be their husband, wife, or their relatives, or their good friends, or even close work colleagues. And that again is often people don't know what to say.
Yeah.
It's like, or do you mention certain things? Do you even mention the fact you know they're dying? Especially in England, that can be quite a taboo subject. So what kind of insight do you have on that?
Well, as I was saying, part of my function was to normalise the experience, and in a way to model that I would come close. In their helplessness and their fear of saying the wrong thing or upsetting the person, they would distance, and I would bridge that distance, and I would say, you know, come in, you know, let's have this conversation.
Yes.
You know, and I would check it out with both parties.
Yes.
You know, I wouldn't force it.
Yes.
But I would facilitate it.
Yes.
And lubricate it.
Yes. I just remember, it's funny how things come into my mind I haven't thought of for years. There was a friend of mine who died many, many years ago called Lawrence. And he was a real character. He really lived a life. So in a way, I don't know if he'd used his time up, but he'd really lived a life in many ways. And he was in hospice in Hampstead in London. He had cancer. And the last time I saw him, I went to see him 3 or 4 times. And the last time I saw him, just before he died, the night before he died, I think it was, he died early the following morning. When I got there, I was the first person I got there, I think, from his other friends came as well. And he wanted to hug me, and he wanted to hug me. And we never really had particularly, you know, we'd have a bear hug relationship, but we never had a real, and he just didn't want to let go of me. It was like he wanted to experience a human hug before he died. Yeah. And it's like, and other people came, and I felt a little bit awkward, but he was holding on to me, so I let him do it as long as he wanted to do it. Right. And then other people said, God, he's really alive. I mean, like energy-wise, because the previous night there'd been a football match and he was asleep the whole time. He said, he's really, and it's like he got, I don't know, it was like, in a way it was a little bit of an awkward experience, but you could tell that's what he wanted, and that was important to him. And I suppose it is in a way that people close to caregivers, as you found with the AIDS people, you have to go over your own taboos, don't you? Yeah. You have to have the courage to
overcoming your own discomfort.
Even they may be small things in a way, compared to working with people who had AIDS when you thought it was a terminal illness. You have to do these things that. And we did have an interview on Conscious TV with a guy called Peter Fenwick a year or so ago, and he's done a lot of research on what he calls end-of-life experiences. This is not near-death experience. This is end-of-life experience. And Peter, you know, he's a psychiatrist. He's very highly regarded. It was all very well researched, and it seems that often when people are near death, something happens, and they regain. If they had Alzheimer's, they regain their, you know, a good degree of consciousness, awakeness, because they pick up that someone close to them who knows that they're dying is coming to visit, and they can be normal with that person. So there's all these other factors that come in. If we can just have the courage to be ourselves, then who knows how that helps someone to end their life in a positive and open way.
Yeah, as you say, it takes courage to be yourself and show up in the fullness of that.
Yeah. So I guess that's one of the messages for caregivers: be yourself, have courage, to try and regard. I think you were saying to try and regard dying as a normal thing.
Meet the person who's dying where they're at.
Yes.
You know, it's really to not impose anything, not impose any ideas of how you feel they should die.
Yes.
You know, really take your cue from them, and help them to find their own way with that.
Yeah. You know, you see when you go to a funeral, you see a lot of people there, and you know that often a lot of the people there really like the person that had gone, but they hadn't been to see them in the last few weeks or whatever, because they'd felt awkward. Not because, they basically felt awkward, and that's so sad that people feel awkward.
Right. Again, that's the courage to sit in the face of that awkwardness.
Yeah.
You know, when we teach our volunteers in hospice, that's one of the key things. It's like, it's not comfortable, you know? It's not a pretty sight. And yet, how can you still be open? You know?
So where have you got, it's quite personal I suppose, but where have you got in your journey to death? Like if you know, you don't know what's going to happen obviously, but let's say something similar happened again, this time it wasn't a false alarm, do you feel that you'd face it in a more prepared way, shall we say? Or you don't know, I guess, do you?
Well, you know, as I say, I felt a big shift because it really cut through the complacency of feeling as though I knew how I was. And that showed me that I didn't. And it reconnected me to the mystery of it. I mean, I don't know how I'll be when it comes time to meet my own death.
Yes.
You know, I mean, the last death I was with was one of my oldest and dearest friends. And, you know, we worked together for 25 years, and she was a psychoanalyst and a Gestalt therapist, and she wanted me to be there with her in her dying process. And it was like an hour before she died, someone played her a last love song on a violin, and then her son and daughter-in-law went to bed, and I just sat with her. And about 20 years before, we had created a visualization called the Great Cycle, and it was the movement of water from the clouds down the mountain through to the ocean and rejoining the source. And as I was standing there, that came back to me, and I started to recite that to her, and I could just feel her letting go, and she died very peacefully. You know, and it was that was something that she and I had created 20 years before, and I hadn't even thought about it until that moment.
And isn't it also another side of it that when someone's dying, you have to be prepared to let them go?
Oh yeah, definitely.
And there are relatives understanding they want to hang on to the person and feel the pain of their departing is too much, and energetically, it's also a question of us letting go when someone's close. And
that's the gift that you can give to someone who's dying, to give them permission to go.
Permission to go,
yeah.
It's another challenge, isn't it? Because again, that's a bit taboo in
our
society.
The key is the attachment. I mean, and that was what I was confronted with when I went into the shock of my own diagnosis. That, you know, in my mind I thought I wasn't attached, but in my body, the animal was still attached. I don't want to leave.
Prakash, we have 3 or 4 minutes left. I'm looking at my notes again. There's nothing that jumps out that we haven't talked about. Anything that you'd like to cover that you think is important on this subject, or anything to do with yourself, really?
Yeah. Well, you know, this whole question of bringing death out of the closet, you know, it's like we feel uncomfortable about it because it's not talked about in a normal way. Every one of us will die. And so let's talk about it. Let's have conversations. There's a new movement called the Death Cafe, where people get together and they have coffee and they talk about death and the dying process.
Oh, really? This is in America,
It's international.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's one in London somewhere.
The Death Cafe.
The Death Cafe.
I've heard of the Death Disco, but...
Oh, I haven't heard that one.
I think that's just music, but the Death Cafe,
yeah. But it's having the conversation.
Yeah. I think also we mentioned the Ridwan School, which, you know, I'm also part of, as you know. I say part of, I'm a student. I think there's also groups there where people do meet to talk about dying, trying to again bring their own feelings out in the open and their own patterns and look at things. Yeah,
yeah, they're end-of-life service groups.
End of life. Yeah,
where each community,
Yeah.
you know, will have to deal with members of their sanghas that will be dying and need support. So instead of waiting until it happens, let's prepare for it.
Yes.
Let's talk about it. And you know, one of the gifts that Hamid gave to the general community was he did a teaching called The Wisdom of Life and Death. And these DVDs are available.
This is Hamid Ali again.
Hamid Ali, yeah.
From the AH Almas.
Almas, yeah. Yeah, where he goes into the questions that come up around, you know, death and dying and life.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, you can feel free. You can feel maybe almost enlightened and feel that you're beyond things, and then something like this happens and brings you way back to the human stuff that isn't necessarily cleared, and your own mortality, obviously, and I guess it comes down to embodying ultimately, doesn't it? You have to embody everything that you learn.
Yeah, it has to be real. You know, and I at that point I thought it was real, and that showed me that no, it hadn't really dropped into my belly. It was still a bit in my head.
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
Okay. Well, the clock's ticking away. We need to close.
Well,
so,
thank you.
Prakash, thank you very much for coming on to Conscious TV. Great work that you do. And thank you for being honest with sharing your own story too, which is always important for people, I think.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody out there again for watching Conscious TV. And you know, if you have, we're always looking for ideas for programs, and we'd like to explore this. I would like to explore anyway this theme of death and dying more, and maybe to go into more detail in different ways. So if you have ideas, then you'll find our website, and you'll find obviously our email address. Do whack us an email, and we'll have a look at it. Okay, thanks again. See you again soon. Goodbye.